Welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into the fascinating world of Caroline Astor, the woman who ruled New York society with an iron fist during the Gilded Age. You might know her as Mrs. Astor, and trust me, she made sure everyone knew that title belonged to her and her alone. Caroline Astor wasn't just wealthy, she was the ultimate gatekeeper of high society. She decided who was in and who was out, who could attend the most exclusive parties, and who would be left standing on the sidewalk looking up at the glittering windows of New York's elite. But even the most powerful social queens have their downfalls, and Caroline's story is filled with scandals, feuds, and family drama that would make today's reality TV look tame. We're going to explore 5 major scandals that defined her reign and ultimately showed the limits of her power. From family feuds over a name to epic social warfare with the Vanderbilts, these stories reveal how one woman tried to control an entire social order, and how that order eventually crumbled around her. So grab your finest tea set because we're about to spill some serious Gilded Age tea. Let's start with the scandal that launched Caroline's social career. And it all began with a death in the family. In 1875, Caroline's father-in-law died, and suddenly there was a question that would split the Astor family apart. Who gets to be called Mrs. Astor? Now, you might think this sounds trivial, but in the 1870s your title meant everything. It wasn't just about respect, it was about power, influence, and your place in the social hierarchy. Being Mrs. Astor meant you were the head of one of America's most prominent families, and Caroline wasn't about to let that slip away. The problem was that Caroline wasn't the only woman with a claim to the title. Her husband's cousin, Caroline Astor Wilson, also believed she deserved the name. Both women were married to Astor men, both had legitimate claims, and both were determined to win. This wasn't just a polite disagreement settled over afternoon tea, this was social warfare. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, our Caroline, made a calculated decision. She tied her identity directly to her son, John Jacob Astor IV, who was the heir to the main Astor fortune. This was brilliant strategy because it meant she wasn't just fighting for a name, she was positioning herself as the mother of the future head of the family. Caroline made it clear that she was the Mrs. Astor of New York, the one who mattered, the one with the real power. She used her influence, her connections, and her sheer determination to make sure everyone knew where the true authority lay. The other Caroline didn't go down without a fight, but eventually she had to accept a compromise that must have stung. She became known as Mrs. Astor of Philadelphia, essentially being relegated to a regional title, while our Caroline claimed the national stage. This victory established Caroline as the undisputed queen of New York society, but it also showed just how ruthless she could be when it came to protecting her position. She had proven that she would fight her own family to maintain her status, and this set the tone for everything that followed. The scandal revealed something important about Caroline's character. She understood that in high society perception was reality. If people believed you were the most important Mrs. Astor, then you were, and she was willing to do whatever it took to control that perception. If the Mrs. Astor title fight was Caroline's first major victory, then her battle with the Vanderbilts was her most spectacular defeat. This scandal changed the entire landscape of American high society and marked the beginning of the end for Caroline's absolute power. The Vanderbilts were incredibly wealthy. We're talking about railroad money, which in the 1880s meant they were among the richest people in America. But there was one problem. They were new money. Caroline represented old money, families who had been wealthy for generations and looked down on anyone who had recently made their fortune. For years, Caroline simply refused to acknowledge the Vanderbilt family. She wouldn't invite them to her parties, wouldn't visit their homes, and certainly wouldn't include them in her exclusive social circle. In Caroline's world, it didn't matter how much money you had. If you hadn't been wealthy for at least 3 generations, you were nobody. Alva Vanderbilt, the wife of William Kissam Vanderbilt, was not the type of woman to accept this treatment quietly. She was ambitious, intelligent, and she had a plan that would force Caroline to recognize her, whether she wanted to or not. In 1883, Alva decided to throw the party of the century. We're talking about a masquerade ball that cost more than most people would see in a lifetime. She hired the best decorators, the finest musicians, and planned entertainment that would make everyone in New York desperate for an invitation. But here's the brilliant part, and the part that must have absolutely infuriated Caroline. Alva didn't invite Mrs. Astor to the party. The woman who controlled every guest list in New York was suddenly on the outside looking in. This created a massive problem for Carolyn. Her own daughter desperately wanted to attend the ball, and all of New York society was talking about it. Caroline was facing something she had never experienced before: social humiliation. The situation became impossible to ignore when Caroline realised that her exclusion from the party was becoming public knowledge. People were starting to whisper about how the great Mrs. Astor had been snubbed by the Vanderbilts. Caroline was forced to do something that must have been incredibly painful for her. She had to pay a social call to Alva Vanderbilt. This wasn't just a friendly visit between neighbours. This was essentially Caroline begging for entry into the new elite, admitting that the Vanderbilts had power she couldn't ignore. The visit was brief but symbolic. Caroline left her calling card, which in the language of high society meant she was acknowledging Alva's social position. It was a surrender, plain and simple. This scandal marked a turning point in American society. It showed that old money exclusivity was crumbling, and that new money could force its way into the higher circles. Caroline had built her power on the idea that she could control who was accepted into society, but the Vanderbilts proved that wealth, no matter how recently acquired, could overcome even her influence. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman who had spent years excluding others based on the source of their wealth had been forced to acknowledge that money, regardless of its age, had the ultimate power. Caroline's next major scandal involved her most famous creation, the 400. This was supposedly a list of the only people in New York who truly mattered socially, and it became one of the most controversial power plays in American society. The story goes that Caroline's ballroom could hold exactly 400 people, so she and her social secretary, Ward McAllister, created this exclusive list of who was worthy of an invitation. But the reality was much more calculated and much more cruel. The 400 wasn't really about ballroom capacity, it was about control. Caroline was essentially creating a social hierarchy with herself at the top, and everyone else fighting for position below her. If you weren't on the list, you were nobody. If you were on it, you had arrived. The problem was how arbitrary and vindictive the whole system appeared to be. People began to notice that inclusion on the 400 seemed to depend more on Caroline's personal feelings than on any objective criteria. Families who had been wealthy for generations might be excluded if they had somehow offended Caroline, while newer families might be included if they had pleased her. Ward McAllister, who helped Caroline manage this social sorting, became a controversial figure himself. People accused him of being a social climber who was using his position to settle personal scores. The whole system began to look less like natural social order and more like manipulation. The controversy grew when people started to question what exactly qualified someone for the 400. Was it wealth, family history, personal character? The answer seemed to change depending on Caroline's mood and preferences. Some families who considered themselves pillars of New York society found themselves excluded, while others who had recently arrived in the city were welcomed in. This inconsistency made people angry and resentful. The scandal reached its peak when newspapers began to criticize the 400 as undemocratic and un-American. Writers pointed out that Caroline was essentially creating an aristocracy in a country that had fought a revolution to escape aristocracy. People began to see the 400 not as a natural social order, but as a power grab by one woman who wanted to control everyone else's social life. The criticism was harsh and personal, with Caroline being portrayed as snobbish, vindictive, and out of touch with American values. The whole concept backfired because it made Caroline's power too visible. When she'd operated behind the scenes, people might have grumbled about her influence, but they accepted it. When she created an official list that excluded people, she made her power too obvious and too easy to criticize. The 400 scandal showed that Caroline's greatest strength, her ability to control social access, could also be her greatest weakness. By making her power too explicit, she had made herself a target for criticism and resentment. While Caroline's other scandals were relatively public, this one was more insidious because it operated in the shadows. Throughout her reign as New York's social queen, Caroline systematically excluded Catholic, Jewish, and newer immigrant families from her social circle, regardless of their wealth or contributions to society. This discrimination was never announced in newspapers or discussed openly at dinner parties, but it was real and it was deliberate. Caroline had created an invisible barrier that was just as effective as any official policy. The exclusion was particularly cruel because it wasn't based on behavior or character. it was based purely on religion and ethnicity. Families who had made enormous contributions to New York, who had built businesses and supported charities, found themselves shut out of the highest levels of society simply because of their background. Jewish families, even those who had been in America for generations and had accumulated tremendous wealth, were particularly targeted. Carolyn's prejudice meant that successful businessmen, philanthropists, and community leaders were treated as social outcasts by the very people who should have been their peers. Catholic families faced similar discrimination, though sometimes it was less absolute. Carolyn seemed to make exceptions for Catholics who had as us. This discrimination had lasting effects on New York society. It created parallel social structures where excluded families formed their own clubs, their own charitable organizations, and their own social networks. Instead of one unified high society, Carolyn's prejudice created multiple competing social worlds. The scandal wasn't just about individual families being hurt, it was about the broader impact on American society. Carolyn's influence was so great that her prejudices became institutionalized in clubs, organizations, and social customs throughout New York and beyond. Perhaps most damaging was how this discrimination contradicted American ideals of equality and opportunity. Carolyn was essentially saying that no matter how successful you became, no matter how much you contribute, the hidden nature of this scandal made it particularly pernicious. Because it wasn't openly discussed, it was harder to challenge or change. People knew they were being excluded, but they couldn't point to specific policies or statements that proved it. This scandal revealed the darkest side of Carolyn's power, her ability to enforce prejudice and discrimination through social pressure and exclusion. It showed that her influence wasn't just about party invitations and social rankings. It was about who got to be considered truly American and truly acceptable. The legacy of this discrimination lasted long after Carolyn's death, contributing to patterns of exclusion and prejudice that would take decades to overcome. The final scandal in Carolyn's story is perhaps the most ironic, because it involved the very person she had used to secure her position as Mrs. Astor, her son, John Jacob Astor IV. Remember, Carolyn had won the battle for the Mrs. Astor title by tying her identity to her son, positioning herself as the mother of the future head of the Astor family. John Jacob Astor IV was supposed to be the embodiment of everything Caroline valued: propriety, restraint, and social respectability. Instead, he became the source of her greatest embarrassment, though thankfully for Caroline, the worst of it happened after her death. In 1909, John Jacob Astor IV shocked New York society by divorcing his first wife, Ava Lowell Willing. Divorce was still scandalous in high society, but that wasn't the worst part. The real scandal came when he immediately married Madeline Force, a woman who was only 18 years old while he was in his 40s. This marriage violated every principle Caroline had spent her life defending. The age difference was considered inappropriate and embarrassing. The quickness of the remarriage after his divorce suggested a lack of the restraint and dignity that Caroline had always demanded. The scandal became even worse because of how public it was. John Jacob Astor IV was one of the most famous men in America, and his personal life became front-page news. The very family name that Caroline had fought so hard to protect was now associated with scandal and impropriety. The social world that Caroline had created began to turn against her son. The same people who had once sought his approval now whispered about his behaviour behind his back. The Astor name, which had once guaranteed social acceptance, became a source of embarrassment. The irony was overwhelming. Caroline had spent decades enforcing strict social codes, excluding people for far less serious violations of propriety. She had demanded that everyone in her social circle maintain the highest standards of behaviour. Now her own son was violating those standards in the most public way possible. The scandal revealed the fundamental weakness in Caroline's system. She had built her power on the idea that social position should be inherited, and that certain families were naturally superior to others. But her own son proved that inherited position didn't guarantee good behaviour or social responsibility. Even worse, the scandal showed that Caroline's influence had limits. She had been able to control who was invited to parties and who was accepted into society, but she couldn't control her own family's behaviour. All her power and influence couldn't prevent her son from embarrassing the family name. The final twist came in 1912 when John Jacob Astor IV died in the Titanic disaster. While his death was tragic, it also meant that the Astor family scandal became part of one of the most famous disasters in history. Instead of being remembered as the dignified heir to a great family fortune, John Jacob Astor became known as the scandalous rich man who died on the Titanic. This scandal completed the destruction of Caroline's carefully constructed social order. The son she'd used to justify her position had ultimately undermined everything she'd worked to build. Caroline Astor's story is ultimately about the limits of control. She managed to dominate New York society for decades, deciding who was in and who was out, who mattered and who didn't. But her scandals reveal that even the most powerful social queens can't control everything. The Mrs. Astor title fight showed her ruthless ambition. The Vanderbilt War demonstrated that new money could challenge old money. The 400 controversy exposed her power as arbitrary and vindictive. Her hidden discrimination revealed the ugly prejudices underlying her social system, and her son's behaviour proved that she couldn't even control her own family. Each scandal chipped away at Caroline's authority until the social order she had created began to crumble. The exclusive world of old money gave way to a more diverse and democratic society, where wealth, regardless of its source, could buy social acceptance. Caroline's legacy is complicated. She was undoubtedly a powerful and influential woman who shaped American society in lasting ways. But she was also a gatekeeper who used her power to exclude and discriminate, enforcing prejudices that had no place in a democratic society. Her scandals remind us that even the most seemingly untouchable people have their weaknesses and that social change is inevitable. The world Caroline tried to control ultimately moved beyond her influence, creating a society that was more open and inclusive than the one she had tried to preserve. In the end, Caroline Astor's greatest scandal might be that she fought so hard to maintain a social system that was destined to fail. Her story is a fascinating glimpse into a world that no longer exists, but it's also a reminder of how social power works, and how it can be both gained and lost. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Gilded Age scandals, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Let me know in the comments which historical figure you'd like to see covered next, and I'll see you in the next video.